what was that, about a year ago now, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more, when there was that controversy over Ernie Gygax, the whole the return of TSR and Giant Lands, and being banned from shit whichever convention, all of them. Uh, and how, like, oddly, that kind of synergizes with Wizards of the Coast's own kind of corporate interests and the interests of their holding companies. Because, it's a convenient way to stomp out the illusion of competition. It's not like a brand new TSR was the original TSR, but it was positioning itself with that brand name, and by bringing in the promise of original writing and artist creators to make a new competition for D&D. uh, Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro seemingly very self-conscious about the fact that they're not actually the ones who created the game, and there is an argument to be made that uh, you know uh, the illusion, at least, that the original crew is back and making a better, superior alternative product to the modern day derivative version that they are producing. As something that could, threaten their title as the number one role playing game product on the market and all that kind of stuff. And so it's just a coincidence that events transpire in such a way to, like, kind of cause the company to implode. And I mean, from what I hear, Giant Lands isn't like the best thing in the world anyway. So if they had just been a bit patient, they didn't necessarily have to stir up any bad blood or any of that kind of stuff, or threaten people's careers and public standing by accusing them of having certain attitudes and all that kind of stuff, yada yada yada. Which, like I said, I think speaks back to the thing about, like, there's an insecurity that they feel over this intellectual property that they purchased, that feels threatened by the idea of the OG people coming back. And I feel that kind of frames into some of my thinking about the open games license and the OSR community, as much as it's trying to reject modern D&D and do its own independent thing and try to recreate the good old days. It's still playing in D&D's backyard. It's all ultimately at Wizards of the Coast's discretion. Yes, it would be a massive, gigantic legal nightmare to try to, like, pull the OSR off the market by revoking the open games license. Uh, but you never know. Mega corporations at some point might decide that that's a good way to go, and just go ahead and dump the money and force all the stuff off the internet. That is directly tied to the rule system they own and all that kind of stuff. I feel, though, the reasons why I don't think that's going to happen is, on a certain level, I don't believe that Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast really think the thing they purchased in the form of Dungeons and Dragons was its rule system. It's much more the brandable settings and brandable creatures that are involved in it, and that's why the OGL is kind of a dumping ground for all the public domain stuff, that all the creatures from mythology, and the fact that you can't really copyright role-playing game rules, from what I gather from how people talk about it, because a few little changes to details here and there, and suddenly it is different enough to be considered to be a different interpretation of the rule set and all that kind of shit. Um, like, in some ways, I'm kind of curious how, if someone could just make an OSR product and not put the OGL on it, and if they actually would get in trouble or not. Because, I mean, once again, as long as you're not using any of D&D's branded stuff, the inclusion of goblins and all that kind of, and trolls, unicorns. I mean, these are all public domain creatures out of mythology. All the old Greek gods and Roman gods and Celtic gods and Viking gods. Those are all public domain. Uh, just tweak what you call the attributes a little bit, to tweak a few character classes here and there. Like I said, I'm curious. I'm not likely to try that, but it'd be an interesting test. But the thing is though, all of that, what that does though, is it keeps all those older gamers captured and still adjacent to D&D. They're not straying away to completely different rule systems and potentially dragging other players and new players to those rule systems. everyone who plays OSR games is still going to have an interest in occasionally picking up a current edition D&D supplement. People that they bring in, first-time players who, eventually move on from that initial play group, have already been kind of introduced and trained to play D&D style stuff. So they're all being kept in-house. It's basically just the OSR kids are allowed to go upstairs and play in the attic with all the old stuff, while downstairs the main parlor is, for the hip new kids who are fresh to the party kind of thing, and they're still trying to impress and rope in with all the various party favors that they're offering them. Ultimately, this notion that D&D has to be the king of the role-playing game community is false. Just because they were the first doesn't imply that they have to be the best or ultimate expression. How many other things of other genres is it the very first one that remains the most popular all these decades, if not centuries later? Are we still like, is Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers still the top science fiction properties, IPs, like they were back in the old days of early movies and stuff? No, we've moved on since then to stuff like Star Wars and Star Trek, and even since then we're starting to move past Star Wars and Star Trek into arguably the Marvel Universe as something that is still kind of technically sci-fi, but also things like The Expanse and other series and shows and things that we haven't even discovered yet, if we're ever able to get past this wall of IP. The problem with role-playing games is that, like D&D has this huge shadow over everything, because they're one of the few companies that were able to weather that little dark period post-2000, where there was like a good decade there where the role-playing game industry really seemed to be on its like last legs and kind of like at risk of being just completely destroyed by modern video games. It's because of the investments, the strategic investments of that company in placing, references to their products in certain TV shows, cartoons, and other things that have kind of helped bring it back into the zeitgeist. The promotion of nerd culture as being pop culture, thanks to the Marvel Universe becoming so popular. There's a variety of things that have like made role-playing games popular again. And D&D seems to be like the number one because of the amount of money the company is spending on its advertising. However, as its customer base, it's on us to either, accept that advertising or ignore it. There's a ton of other games. When I got into gaming in the late 80s, early 90s, that was a period where D&D of the time was kind of fading out. There were still people who played it, but the majority of people had moved on to other things. There were people playing Rifts. There were people playing, Heroes Unlimited. There were people playing, Cyberpunk 2020. There were people playing all the various World of Darkness games. There were people playing Call of Cthulhu, Deadlands. I mean, it was a wide open array of different options. And there, for a period of time there in the 90s, Dungeons and Dragons was not the dominant role-playing game system. It was not the dominant role-playing game. It still might have been the most famous, but with that fame came an awful lot of cultural baggage that, and also in some ways as a gamer, made you less of a social pariah. Telling people at school or even in public as a young adult that, I play Vampire the Masquerade doesn't ring the same bell in their heads as telling them that you play Dungeons and Dragons and all that kind of stuff. So, the fact that we've become so like laser fixated on D&D and like acting as if like the entire health of the role-playing game industry is all entirely dependent on D&D. That's kind of a failure of us as fans as a whole to have thrown ourselves so heavily into Dungeons and Dragons. They put out a polished product. It's pretty. It's covered in art. They got all sorts of accessories. Ironically, almost as if designed by a company that originally was making products that were supposed to get people to endlessly collect things, so that they're never done spending money on it. It's just a coincidence that D&D's turned out to be like that. Always new cards, always a new book, always a new DM screen. Oh, you want a DM screen that's specifically for dungeoneering, or do you want a DM screen that's specifically for wilderness adventuring, or do you want one that's customized to the setting you're using, or all this kind of shit. you know, I don't, yeah, like I said, it's our own fault that they are the beasts that they are, and it's our own fault for being children being distracted by keys. There are other options. There've always been other options. There are options that can easily outshine Dungeons and Dragons again, if but the community were to embrace them. Unfortunately, though, much like Hollywood, role-playing games themselves too seem to have fallen into this, intellectual property trap. The amount of games out there that are based on TV shows and movies right now is nuts. There's so few things, I mean, out there that are actually truly 100% original creations that have original rules, an original setting that's not based on something else. And that isn't, like here's Star Trek or, here's Witcher or just whatever is currently popular. And the fact that a few of the old mainstay role-playing games have themselves turned themselves into intellectual properties now, with Cyberpunk now being a video game, and D&D now being a TV show and a Twitch stream series, and soon to be a hit movie starring Chris Pine and Hugh Grant, and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I mean, what am I saying here? Like, any of you watching this who are into D&D aren't going to be like, yeah, he's right, fuck D&D, I'm going to play something else. And those of you who already are on the same tip will be like, yeah, I agree, hit that like button, hit that subscribe. So I guess hit like and subscribe, or unsubscribe and hit thumbs down. Whatever. Nothing has any meaning anymore. Stay waspinated.